Welcome back to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey. In today's episode, I interview Richard Hanania, who has done a huge amount of data-driven work on a wide variety of policy topics. We discuss affirmative action and its rejection by voters, despite it being pushed by very prominent institutions in our country. We discuss the government corruption and incompetence that was affecting the war in Afghanistan effort for nearly 20 years. We discuss the tyranny of politicized experts and many other topics, so I hope you enjoy our interview. I am so delighted to welcome my guest today, Richard Hanania, who is an author who writes mostly about American politics and international affairs. He's a research fellow at the University of Texas and the president and founder of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. He is the author of a book called Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy: How Generals, Weapons Manufacturers, and Foreign Governments Shape American Foreign Policy. Richard, welcome to the show. I'm so pleased to have you on.
Thank you, Paige. I'm really glad to be here.
So one reason why I wanted to have you on This Is Your Country is because you are able to speak about issues that tend to be very controversial, very emotionally laden in the public discourse in a way that is incredibly erudite and very sophisticated and always underpinned with a huge amount of data. So your methodology, I think, is unique, and you're a pioneer in how you discuss a lot of these issues. So the first one I would like to get into is the topic of affirmative action. And you wrote a recent essay on your Substack titled Affirmative Action as a Magic Bullet. And you write that this could be an issue that is very powerful for the Republican Party to take on because it's a form of legal discrimination that is very unpopular. And it grates on people, even sympathetic to the systemic racism conspiracy theory, as unjust and un-American. So you cite a lot of data in the essay, which I will link to in the show notes. And one example that you discuss is that affirmative action is roundly rejected, even in deep blue areas, including California. And that happens pretty much every time voters have the opportunity. In 2020, there was an affirmative action ballot measure in California that would have allowed California's public agencies, universities, community colleges, and so on to consider race, gender, and ethnicity when making decisions on contracting, hiring, and student admission. Coverage at the time said, for the second time in a quarter century, Californians appear to have overwhelmingly rejected affirmative action. In 1996, Proposition 209, which banned affirmative action, won by 10 points, 54.5% in favor and 45.5% opposed. In 2020, when it came up again, 56.1% of votes cast were against the measure, while nearly 44% of votes were in favor. Can you speak to the unpopularity of affirmative action with voters, as well as the interest groups that fight to keep it in so many domains of society?
Yeah, so racial preferences are everywhere in American society, and it's something that, politicians used to talk about. Richard Nixon talked about, being against quotas. George H.W. Bush talked about being against quotas. Ronald Reagan tried to do a little bit about it, which I've written about before. But the issue sort of just, dropped off the radar. In the last 20, 25 years, it really just hasn't been an issue for Republicans, even though institution after institution have becoming more race conscious and sex conscious, and the preferences are just there or greater than they've ever been before. And this is a strange thing, but what people need to realize, and what people involved in politics should realize, is this stuff is massively, massively unpopular. If you ask people, do you like affirmative action? If you just say, you want to help minorities, people will say, sure. If you ask people, should race be a factor in college admissions or getting a job? It'll be, numbers that we don't see for anything else, 70, 80% going back decades, people opposing these kinds of programs. And, people on the left will sort of obfuscate. I mean, they changed the they changed the phrase. They don't say affirmative action anymore. They say diversity, but it's pretty much the exact same thing. Republicans have sort of gone along with that lie, but we're still talking about institutions classifying people by race and sex, and then giving some people preferences over others. And so when you look at ballot initiatives, it's been voted on 9 times, and eight times the voters rejected it, and then at one time they didn't reject it by just 1%. People vote, 55, 60%, which is not as high as the 70, 80%, but ballot initiatives, it's hard to get even 55, 60%. That's very rare. So it's been rejected at the ballot box. We have, other kinds of evidence too. David Shore, the Democratic pollster and a political scientist. He polled people on 113 different Democratic policy positions, gave the Republican response, and showed that affirmative action was the second most unpopular liberal position. So it's really, I mean, it is really something that people do not like on these ballot initiatives. In the California one, the pro-affirmative action side outspent the opposition by like 16 times, and they still lost pretty badly, once again in California. And so this is a topic I think that Republicans should take up. And it's a little bit of a mystery as to why they don't and why they haven't. I talk a little bit about that in the article, but this is a fundamentally important issue, Paige. I don't think it's just important. You could sell it as a fairness thing. I don't think it's just a fairness thing. I think that the people who get into institutions through affirmative action, they're generally incompetent. They can see their incompetence. They get angry about it, and they go and they try to shut down people's speech. So there's a downstream effect of letting these incompetent people into institutions, universities, and other places based in identity. They fundamentally change the institutions. And so this is something worth doing, not just because of fundamental fairness. You don't want to discriminate against whites or against men, but it's a way to remake the institutions by not having them be race and sex conscious.
Right. And one thesis that we explore on this show is the extent to which propaganda can control what is on the agenda for the public discourse, what the media will the terms by which the media will dictate what's on the public's mind. And it seems to me that they timed that ballot measure in California kind of thinking, I'm sure they saw polling for years that the public's mind did not budge on this issue, but they really thought that after that the Summer of Love, George Floyd's eternal funeral, they thought that they would be able to change enough minds based on the sort of systemic racism, full court press getting Americans to be focused on the issue of racism, that would be maybe the turnkey, the impetus for voters to change their minds on it. And clearly that didn't work. So I just think that that's interesting that even in that primed ecosystem that voters were still saying no thank you. And
yeah,
so,
I didn't think about that being right during George Floyd, when like polls say that support for Black Lives Matter reached its peak. That was only a few months later. And also 2020, also Washington State, closer margin, but also rejected in Washington State. So not exactly a hotbed of conservatism. The exact same result.
Right. Right. That's an interesting trend that even in these deep blue places that voters don't budge. So a second issue that you've written a lot about that I think is very misunderstood in the public's mind is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the sort of ensuing legal doctrine. And so this, in a way, it goes beyond polls and public opinion and ballot measures, because this is, as I say, it's a legal doctrine, and the difficulties with the stranglehold that the civil rights doctrine has over American society is it's gained steam among the intelligentsia on the American right, especially with this book published a couple of years ago by an author named Christopher Caldwell entitled The Age of Entitlement, which describes its totalizing effect on our country. And the scholarship that I think you have enlightened this area of scholarship as well, showing that the Civil Rights Act is a very misleading policy, right? That it's far from simply aiming to reduce segregation, reducing maltreatment of people. It actually ushered in a virtually endlessly powerful legal framework that has steamrolled the country and its institutions. And so you wrote another piece that I will also link to titled How Reagan Almost Crushed Wokeness. Can you explain how the Civil Rights Act had consequences so contradictory to what it was purported to do, and walk through the history from the 60s to the Reagan era backlash?
Oh goodness, that's a broad topic. But yeah, if people are interested, the Reagan the Reagan article, How Reagan Almost Crushed Wokeness, and also I have an earlier piece called Woke Institutions is Just Civil Rights Law. So when people think about the Civil Rights Act, it said it ended Jim Crow segregation. I mean, it did do that, and then it ended discrimination in employment and made it illegal. Okay, so that most people would say, okay, that's either either good or it's not so bad. Maybe we have a question about whether the federal government should be telling private employers what to do. I mean, that constitutionally, traditionally was not seen as the role of the federal government, but whatever, you could think, okay, they did that. But it does so much more than that. Just soon after the Civil Rights Act was passed, we had the doctrine of disparate impact. So if you want, and the thing is, if you go back to the debate at the time, people foresaw that this could happen. And they specifically, said no way it can happen. And they even wrote a clause into the Civil Rights Act that said, any professionally administered standardized test, that can be used. That's okay. And there was also, people who senators who voted on the bill. I mean, talking about things like, if you set the qualifications and all the people hired are white, that's fine. That we're not trying to touch that. It's just about discrimination based on race. But what happens is soon after, and this is in like the Supreme Court in the Griggs versus Duke Power case, and then the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they had the disparate impact doctrine. So theoretically, anything you do, if I give a test and more white people do well than black people, I could still maybe get away with it, but I have to, you could be sued and you have to defend yourself. There has to be a justification for it. And you have to, there's a burden of proof on you. And it's not just standardized tests. It's just about, anything else. Anything has a disparate impact, criterion you could set is going to be perfect across every single racial group across the two sexes. And so what this means is basically government has arbitrary power. It can say standardized tests are bad. College degrees also have a disparate impact. More white people than black people, and especially more than Hispanics, have college degrees. That's somehow okay. Why is that okay? And why are standardized tests where you don't have to get a credential or go to university, why is that not okay? Well, the bureaucrats and the judges, they like colleges and they don't like IQ tests. And so this is arbitrary government power. So that's Title VII. That's employment. You also have this thing called Title VI, which says that anything that receives government funding cannot discriminate based on race. Title IX comes later and says based on sex. You can imagine what discriminate based on race or discriminate based on sex means. This has meant under Democratic administrations, if you have a school and you discipline white students at a different rate than black students, because they behave differently, the federal government can threaten to take away your funding. The Title IX stuff, it's been used to say, okay, you have to have equal participation between men and women in college sports. Now, what if men want to play more sports? Who cares? No, that's a stereotype. We can't have that because Title IX says no discrimination. Schools get federal funding. They have to equalize male and female participation in sports. And then they also, they've applied this to high school and primary schools too. The Title IX rape kangaroo courts. That's also civil rights law. The trans stuff in schools and colleges and then primary schools, also Title IX stuff. So these things, you have Title VII, which reaches the private sector. You have, Title VII, then you have Title VI, and then later Title IX that reaches things that receive government funding, which is basically all of education. And between that, you have basically a bureaucratic class that can, do whatever they want on these race and sex issues.
Right, exactly. And I'm glad you brought up disparate impact because we, especially, as I say, after 2020, where the media and many other institutions pushed to make race the central issue that everything in society needed to be reorganized around, they started... I saw an uptick in news articles, studies, talking points from politicians about how certain issues were affecting minorities unfairly. And this could be anything ranging from... a prominent example recently was, I think they had some study in Houston, Texas, that showed that pollution was affecting minority communities more than it was affecting other communities. And therefore, sometimes they don't always say that therefore, our solution is, but to me, it's a cudgel, it's a threat of a civil rights lawsuit. That if corporations who they accuse of doing the polluting, or the government that doesn't apply regulations that they favor to prevent what they call this disparate impact, then you better be really scared of the civil rights lawsuit that's coming coming down the pike and smearing you as a racist, smearing you as someone who is participating in systemic racism, smearing you as someone who is violating the sacred American Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so it's become wrapped up, as I say, as this legal cudgel. It's very threatening. I think it's scary to people. And so we'll talk more in this interview about the ways that certain private sector institutions, you've mentioned Lockheed Martin, sort of finessed and refined these tools for affirmative action and for complying with what the government wants. But you see, once I started reading more scholarship, including yours, about how this law affects things in our country, you see where it becomes this implied threat. And so I don't know if that's something you've seen elsewhere, other ridiculous examples of the disparate impact. If you have, you're free to speak about them. Otherwise, we'll move to the next question.
Oh, I mean, it's endless. I mean, one thing they're always obsessed about is the national parks. It's like, oh, white people go to Yellowstone. Like who cares? Like, imagine caring about this. It's insane. But you'll see like New York Times articles about this. They have this system where, like, I don't know, they had a first come first serve for camping spaces in national parks, and they wanted to switch to internet because that was also, or maybe it was maybe the racist internet was racist. I don't know, something was racist, but like whatever. But the black people got more camping, which like black people don't even seem to care about this stuff. Like that was the policy that the national park system had to implement. And yeah, it's not even the Civil Rights Act. There's also required affirmative action for government contractors. I mean, these corporations like Lockheed Martin. I mean, I don't blame them. People don't understand. There's an executive order called Executive Order 1246, signed under Johnson, expanded under Nixon, which Reagan tried to, modify, and I talk about that in my Ronald Reagan piece. Basically requires every employer to classify their workers, everyone who has a government contract, which is most of the major corporations, and their subcontractors, to classify their employees by race and sex, and then achieve parity in different job categories. So people don't get it. People just see this wokeness. They see this one-off thing. Oh, this company is doing this. This company. No, there's a legal regime. I mean, there is a legal regime that basically makes this stuff that requires race conscious, sex consciousness, preferences, and these institutions to be just obsessed with identity. It's like amazing that it's like hard even to blame the institutions, because you can't be a business and not do that. It's like having a social security, collecting social security on the payroll. I mean, it's just required doing business in this country, and these are laws, and these laws potentially can be changed.
Right. And one thing that I think is particularly troubling to Americans is that it tends to be the corollary to these legal cudgels threatening civil rights suits. We won't do a lawsuit if you do some type of reparations to make it better and to fix the disparate impact. And then it ends up being this sort of outright game of patronage politics where, or almost like mob enforcement, right? Or like pay us to go away and we won't give you any trouble. Yeah.
There was this Airbnb story that like they were accused of people didn't want to stay in black people's houses, or black people that weren't getting out. I don't know, something like that. Who knows if it's, true. They make these allegations and nobody ever checks, but they ended up hiring Eric Holder to be like, their guy who's going to like protect them against future lawsuits accusing them of racism. And Eric Holder recommended we do X, Y, and Z, and now we do X, Y, and Z. So we're off the hook. Yeah, it is a scam. I mean, from the attorney general to like some of the largest corporations. I mean, it is you'll see Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton talk about Silicon Valley not hiring enough minorities, and this is a shakedown. I mean, this is sort of high-end mafia tactics.
That's right.
That's given sanction through the legal system.
And it's even come to a point where it's hurting people pretty badly. In my favorite example is when Chesa Boudin in San Francisco was saying, well, we can't possibly prosecute these crimes where you have drug dealers selling people fentanyl that they die from, because if these dealers were to get in trouble, they're all from Honduras and they're here illegally, and then they would be deported. So we have to be mindful of the impact that this enforcement may have. And at this point, I think that is something where even the most, open-minded, open-hearted person who says, well, we've got a lot of systemic racism, we need to be mindful of disparate impact in every corner of society, they might say, I don't know if drug dealers killing people with fentanyl from Honduras in our country illegally should necessarily be a protected class. I don't even know if they're entitled to.
It's worse than that. I mean, they'll go like, Yeah, I mean they'll go after the death penalty, and like, oh, you're discriminating against the black murderers versus the white murderers, and the black murderers. It's like, okay, first of all, they're not the same. Maybe the black murderers, their crimes were more heinous, but it's like, I'm against all murders. The Supreme Court, there was the states used to try to do like mandatory death penalty and stuff like that, but the courts wouldn't let them do that, and then they let they let there be judges and juries decide this thing. And it's like, oh no, disparate impact. The murderers are treated unfairly. It's crazy. Yeah, the civil rights stuff is also the Ferguson, when they had the Michael Brown stuff, when the DOJ started investigating the Ferguson police department, and of course they found out that the Michael Brown story was nonsense, but then still they managed to accuse the police department of racism or whatever. The only reason the Justice Department had any jurisdiction to do that was because they get money like all police forces, and this was Title VI, the Civil Rights Act. So it's everywhere. I mean, these a few laws just reach the tentacles of everywhere. And even if you're a lawyer, this stuff is maybe easier to understand. But even if you're not a lawyer, it's not that complicated. There is just like a few laws that you need to do well, and once you see it everywhere.
Yes, exactly. And a deeply flawed, poorly designed policy has so many institutions in our country hostage, and it's hurting people, as we've seen with some of these instances of criminals and drug dealers and so on. So another thing that you have written about is how civil rights law and affirmative action actually have the capacity to degrade institutions when the priority becomes meeting certain quotas based on different characteristics instead of the competence or the credentials or whatever it is, the qualifications of the people doing certain jobs. And so that's where it stops being a cultural issue or an ideological issue or a propaganda dispute, and it's actually harming the public interest. And so, I mean, you can just look at the newly woke NASA. It has totally turned into a punchline. They can't get rockets off the ground. That New York City is even agitating to pass a law that says that there's not enough female and minority representation in the fire departments, and therefore they may find some way to cajole or force the fire departments in New York City to hire on these quotas, when you would think that at least hopefully that would be an untouchable realm of society where the qualifications really matter. Medical schools, engineering disciplines, and more. So can you share some of your findings or observations from different fields where this is really causing things to go south?
Yeah, I mean it's really bad, because it would actually be better if you just had quotas. People, affirmative action is not exactly like, okay, we're just going to hire 10% blacks, because if you did that, actually you could still have like a standardized test, and you could at least get the best of each race. It's like, no, blacks don't do as well on the test, therefore the test is racist. Therefore you have to pick cops or firefighters based on a lottery. And some of these things are ridiculous. So they'll go after things like psychological tests for or criminal background checks for people who want to be police officers or have roles where they sort of need to be trusted to behave ethically. Things like height requirements for police officers, like, oh, you have a height requirement, you have police, you have to be 5'3" to be police. Well, that excludes women. I mean, we can't have that. We have to, reconsider. You can have these very small, these dwarf police officers, because otherwise, we're going to be sexist. And so, in general, the standardized tests are a pretty good way to sort people. You can BS grades, you can BS interviews. You can't BS IQ tests or things that are based on mathematical abilities. And guess what? They show major race and sex differences. And so these things are problematized throughout education. The University of California system just got rid of their standardized test requirements. Well, how do you pick students then? I mean, everyone who puts the least bit of effort gets A's now. They can pick based on demographics, even though California legally they're not supposed to. And then things like politics, things like who's done the most kind of woke activism. So this is a war on human freedom. It's a war on merit. I mean, it's a war on basic honesty, just like letting the public understand how institutions are supposed to function. I mean, they all say the civil rights laws, they're colorblind. They don't say only discriminate against white men. They say no discrimination based on race, based on sex. People say they're institutions are forced to say they're equal employment, equal opportunity employers, and the civil rights law make them behave, in the exact opposite of that. So what kind of, how do people trust anything? How do people trust institutions? How do people, listen to so-called experts? I mean, it's just, I think it's bad in so many ways, and I think it's behind a lot of the social turmoil we see.
That's right. And one angle from which you have addressed this was in the foreign policy sphere, and specifically with the war in Afghanistan. And you did a very significant reporting Twitter thread on this in like December of 2019. And that was actually how I first came to start following you back when I was lurking anonymously and working in the White House. And I couldn't put my face and name behind what I was doing, but I was reading so much all the time, especially, and some from your account. And so you, I'd love to have you talk a little bit about what was found in the Afghanistan papers published by the Washington Post about all of the corruption, this huge mess that was going on between the contractors and the quote unquote experts and so on. And I will also, for the benefit of our listeners, cite this observation that you repeated from Michael Flynn. Quote, "There is a machinery that is behind what we do, and it keeps us participating in the conflict because it generates wealth." And your commentary was, quote, "More precisely, it transfers wealth from the taxpayer to others, destroying wealth in the aggregate." So can you walk our listeners through some of the highlights of just what a corrupt mess this was in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so the Afghanistan war lasted 2 decades. I mean, the cost runs into the trillions, and we left behind, I mean, nothing. I mean, not a government that could survive, could survive a day without American support. And you wonder where that money went. I mean, you spend orders of magnitude more than the GDP of Afghanistan. You think you can build some kind of functioning country, and so what were we doing? I mean, we had the goal, I think, was probably unrealistic from the beginning. We didn't understand anything about that country. We didn't talk to the Taliban until the Trump administration, while they were the strongest independent force within the country, and the anecdotes. This came out in the Washington Post. The Washington Post sued to get these documents called the Afghanistan papers, which people can look up, or they can Google my Twitter thread that pulls out some of the highlights. They really, the government investigated it itself, and they found just ridiculous amounts of corruption. That we were putting more money into Afghanistan than we could even keep track of. I mean, there was the politicians over there. Many of them were corrupt. Some of them were drug dealers. Some of them were accusing others of being enemies, collaborating with the other side. I have another Substack collection of Afghanistan content because there's so much. I wrote a book review of there was a book that the Washington Post journalist who worked on the Afghanistan papers wrote, called the Afghanistan Papers. I wrote a review for that for Reason magazine, and so I have that. I have my Twitter threads. I have other articles in my Substack collection of Afghanistan content. And yeah, I mean, Iraq is another story too. So we've had 20 years, I think, of consistent failure here in the foreign policy establishment. That thankfully, at least we're done with the Middle East wars, at least the ground wars. I mean, we're still involved in other ways.
Yeah, and I remember one particularly silly anecdote. It was something like, they were advocating, instead of building one well in each town, they were saying, no, build one well between the towns. And then the warring tribes will be compelled to collaborate with each other. That is a step toward democracy. So it was, these conceits that were just so ill-designed and so ridiculous. And I remember reading that and just being struck by the arrogance and the misconceptions of what we were doing there, as well as this methodology that consulting firms and defense contractors had figured out for siphoning out this public money, as you say, destroying wealth. Like, this is not benefiting the country. It's being sucked up by these people who are doing a terrible job.
Yeah, I mean, you think about, American wars, and you think about sort of, the military going out and, figuring ways to kill people. And yeah, there was a lot of that in the Afghanistan war. But sort of the day-to-day, operations of, how the U.S. was going to build a government and the kind of society that was going to live behind. The types of people who decided these things were people with political science degrees who worked in the State Department or worked for the UN or worked for these NGOs. And they just came in with these ideas. Okay, the the country didn't even have basic security, and they're saying, okay, we need a sexual harassment policy in the police, in the police force in Afghanistan. I mean, just these things that these young Western liberals would think are desirable, had no connection to a reality in a country where we couldn't even establish order. So I think it's a good demonstration of sort of the goal, the disconnect between our goals in these foreign countries and the methods that we apply to achieve those goals, and sort of what it looks like. Like nobody signed up to go fight in Afghanistan because they thought they were going to implement some NGO ideal of creating equal rights between men and women in this tribal society. But that was sort of the way the war ended up going.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it seems that that still dictates a lot of the people in charge of our foreign policy today. If you hear how the Secretary of State Blinken, the Biden's national security advisor, all of these different advisors, they talk in these ideological abstractions, in these utopian ideals about how every effort that we engage in across the globe, whether it's our participation with the United Nations, our support of the war in Ukraine, whatever it is, it always has these underpinnings of these things that have almost nothing to do with the material prosperity or stability of these governments. And something that I've long argued is that when you talk in silliness like that, you are discrediting your own insight. You are discrediting your capacity to advocate for America's national interest because you are so devoted to silliness. And I think that maybe at the time there were enough people surrounding the Bush administration to sort of manage how they were, presenting to the public, that they were speaking in more sort of militaristic terms. They were speaking more in terms of, they managed to make a more convincing case for the national interest. But when you've got these Obama types and these Biden types in there, it is like a Yale political science seminar where they're sitting around for 4 hours discussing theories. Everything is abstract, nothing is real, and nothing is really connected to the national interest or to anything realistic whatsoever. So, dovetailing this into this book that you've written recently called Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy, How Generals, Weapons Manufacturers, and Foreign Governments Shape American Foreign Policy. You've written also some Substack pieces about what your findings in this book. And what are some of the major misconceptions about how foreign policy is made, some of the factors that you think are improperly considered? Speak on that.
Yeah, so American foreign policy people, the title has part of it, the illusion of grand strategy. And I think the way most people think about foreign policy, whether they agree with it or they disagree with it, they think there's some kind of plan, there's some kind of connection between the goals we apply and what we're, the means we apply and the goals we're trying to achieve in the world. And then if you look at actually, a lot of the major foreign policy decisions and a lot of the major, foreign policy issues of the last few generations, you don't really find that. First of all, I mean, what you find is a lot of corruption. So generals, almost to a man now, at the top level, when they retire, they go work for weapons manufacturers. They go work for defense contractors. They have these think tank posts. These think tanks are often, supported by those same interests. We have a lot of, foreign lobbying in this country, and if you look at something like the war on terror. For example, it was just complete improvisation. Like, it's not like the Bush administration or the Obama administrations, went in there and said, we're going to, build a feminist democracy. I mean, that wasn't the goal from the beginning. It was basically they responded to 9/11, and then they were just sort of dragged along. They didn't feel like they could leave. And then sort of inertia took over, and the people in government did the things that they do. They focus on, sexual harassment training and democracy building and all these other things that, sound good in theory, but may or may not work depending on the circumstances. The U.S. relationship with China. I mean, people think there was this plan we would trade with China and then we would become friends. I don't buy that. I think that's like just a post hoc. I think there was a lot of business pressure to open up trade with China, and then there was this idea that we have to confront China after that. After it started to inevitably grow as it would when it opened up its economy. And then, I think the NATO stuff, the NATO expansion, which we've recently seen, I think, blow up in our faces with the war in Ukraine. What people were doing obviously didn't work. I mean, the Ukrainians are fighting well, but this is not a good outcome for Ukraine. It's not a good outcome for anybody. It was just completely sort of below the radar. Nobody was discussing it. I mean, there was the guy. There was Lockheed Martin, the defense contractor, was instrumental in basically pushing for NATO expansion. They were also the people who were behind the neoconservatives, the Project for a New American Century, who ended up being the forces in the Bush administration behind the Iraq War. And I think the system is geared towards having certain outcomes which are good for these special interests, these bureaucrats and these generals and these defense contractors. And not towards necessarily advancing international peace and security or the well-being of the United States. Now, the military, actually, I mean, I think that we have to keep in mind there is competence there that we don't see in other areas of government. I'm just reading Paul Mango's book on Operation Warp Speed. I mean, it was only the military could do that, could do the logistics here, a lot of the things in there. And I think we see a certain level of competence in this support for Ukraine that we didn't see in Afghanistan and Iraq. But even Afghanistan and Iraq, I mean, the military was very good at killing people and keeping the troops supplied and all that. So there is a lot to sort of admire there. It just gets and there are these systems that actually do work, but there's a lot of there's a lot of corruption there as far as what the foreign policy goals are, and then of course there's the woke stuff which is everywhere, but it's also seeped into the military recently.
I'm glad you mentioned the role of Lockheed Martin in pushing for NATO expansion, because it always struck me as so funny that as soon as Putin invaded Ukraine, this enormous effort to insist this was totally unprovoked. He's a madman. He's going crazy. He's putting the world at risk with his unprovoked attacks and invasions. And I just wanted to point to every instance of Biden saying, basically advocating for NATO expansion and contradicting the fact that Putin has said for a very long time, like, this is a red line to me, and this is unacceptable. I regard this as threatening behavior. And all of Biden's advisors lining up to say, Ukraine would be welcomed into NATO, giving this almost illusion that they would give whatever support was necessary, that they would even potentially fight the war on behalf of Ukraine. And then for this propaganda to come out saying, totally unprovoked, this came out of nowhere, terrifying madman. I think it's important to uncover some of these elements that were really agitating for this type of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's there's moral outrage directed towards the Russian war effort, and it's not never justified to invade another country. But at the same time, we sort of have to, consider carefully what we would think if the shoe was on the other foot. If Russia or China was making alliances with, Canada or Mexico, we wouldn't tolerate that for a second. We wouldn't tolerate. We have a Monroe Doctrine, which says the entire Western Hemisphere is off limits to other powers. So Russia wanted something similar. I mean, it considered Ukraine a long part of, something a country was deeply intertwined with. And they cared about the idea of bringing the U.S. bringing Ukraine into NATO. Now, what Biden and some people in the administration would say would be they would say Ukraine was not going to join NATO anytime soon, which was true, but still, I mean, our military advisors were there. We were deepening military cooperation. It was clear that this was the long-term goal. And I think there's been a good article by a guy named Rob Lee about the run up and basically how Ukraine was becoming better armed over time and was basically going to be a bigger threat to Russia as time goes on. Ukraine was turned out to be stronger than people thought in this war, but that just shows that over time it was getting stronger. It potentially could have been if not a threat to Russia, then a threat to these areas that Russia has claimed sort of protectorate of in eastern Ukraine, which you could say it's not fair. That's Ukrainian territory, but countries do have these interests that they care about in their backyard. I think one thing, whatever you say about, Putin's intentions or the wisdom of past policies, the people who were in charge were the people who were in favor of NATO expansion this whole time. And, they'll say, maybe we should have, brought Ukraine into NATO earlier or whatever. I mean, but look, we didn't have people who were skeptical of NATO and we had basically Congress voting unanimously to bring these countries like Montenegro into the alliance. It would have, the Senate. I mean, it would have done the same for Ukraine if and when it happened. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a history here. A lot of people didn't start paying attention until February 24th, 2022, when this war started. But there's a big discussion here about everything that led up to it.
Right. And to me, you can look back at a lot of the media coverage from, 2 years prior, where it seems clear that Putin was looking for assurances that the Biden administration would not do what he was suspecting they would do. They would not provide those assurances, and which is something you can do from a position of strength. You're not acquiescing to a foreign leader if you find something that's in both the national interest of both countries. And so to me, the fact that this escalated into this destructive conflict is an indictment of Biden's diplomatic capabilities, that they had the chance to engage in diplomacy that would have resulted in wins for both sides, and they refused and then insisted that this was a totally unprovoked, spontaneous event. So anyway, if you go back and look at the media coverage, you can see this building, you can see it escalating, and his advisors basically ignoring it and tuning it out. So that, to me, is a diplomatic failure that could have saved lives. But okay, and I want to turn to this other element of your sort of expertise is fake thesis. You have a lot of different domains that you've written about, and written about in really enlightening ways. So you wrote this essay in the New York Times, "Just Trust the Experts, We're Told We Shouldn't." And so obviously, after the public health bureaucracy torched its own credibility on COVID, I think that you've got a lot more Americans skeptical of quote unquote experts. They're more keen to spot what they perceive as politically motivated propaganda being laundered through the patina of expertise, academia, and so on. So what are some antidotes to our defective expert class?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for, people because you don't know, who to trust. I don't think we can have like no experts, no knowledge, no anything. Everyone just, decides everything for themselves. You have to trust people, but it's very hard when they make fools of themselves, when they, say everyone needs to lock down forever. And then they say, well, the memory of George Floyd means that racism is a bigger public health. I mean, I think it's become in the last, 2 years since, especially 2020, especially since the era of, it's like George Floyd is like, like Christ, like before Floyd and like after Floyd. It's just like a different country. It's I think become so blindingly obvious to people that something is very wrong. But, there's a history of, trying to test expertise. So a guy named Phil Tetlock, a psychologist at Penn, has looked at basically, can experts predict better than intelligent lay people who are paying attention to what's going on, and they generally can't. They generally can't predict their they generally can't predict in their own field better than lay people. So there are people who are good forecasters. I think one thing that would be highly beneficial is to use betting markets. We have at the Salem Center in collaboration with CSPI, we're having basically a forecasting tournament where you can bet on different outcomes like elections and what's the course of the Russia-Ukraine war and economic data. And then we're going to hire a research fellow based from the people who do best on that. So there are mechanisms to sort of keep track. Tetlock talks about he tried to get public intellectuals to publicly state their predictions and give odds so you could see over the long run. And basically none of them would do it. I mean, some people do that. Scott Alexander, your listeners should read if they don't. Matt Iglesias, who's a liberal, who's also done these things. I've done my own probabilities, and I want people to keep me honest and see where I've been right and see where I've been wrong. But yeah, there's a problem here. I think that I guess the best advice you could give is if it's important enough, I think you should you could do your own research. Sometimes you can't, and I think you just have to trust who you can. And I think you look at people who have been right and who've seemed to have good cognitive habits. What doesn't work, I think we've seen is just going to the people with the fanciest degrees or going to the most prestigious media and saying whatever they think is right, because sometimes those people are right, but often they're very, very wrong. Right.
Exactly. And that's an interesting methodology you have for hiring this new research fellow, basically, who has the demonstrated capability to make correct predictions. But it can also be, there are lots of things that are impossible to predict. And I think to me that speaks to why it's so important to elect people with good judgment and good sense who can react appropriately to new information, especially when, and I've seen this firsthand, when the highly politicized government bureaucracy and the media pressure are applied to influence decision making. And I think that it's something that, I mean, it reminds me of when the media used to insult President Trump for saying he doesn't look at his briefing book. And he was sort of like, well, this is information prepared by people with a very obvious agenda that at times contradicts the will of the people. So if I need information, I can, request information, but I'm not going to blindly follow what anonymous people working from the basement of the Pentagon are assembling into a binder for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's you have to decide. I mean, at some point you have to decide, are these people trustworthy or
Right.
not? And at some point you learn, and maybe you take their advice seriously, or you discount it. I think that's completely reasonable. You don't just say because they're the people in the government who are responsible for. I mean, like look at like Anthony Fauci. I mean, look at these people in public health. They're absolutely terrible, and they're terrible because like the smart people on the internet would know what's going on, months before they do, and they would always catch up and say, oh, the science is changing. And sometimes they'll say we lied, that Fauci will say we were lying. Like, why should I believe you now? Like, you're telling me that you sometimes lie to the public for their own good. Like,
Right, exactly.
If you do that, why should I trust you?
Yeah, when they were saying don't go and wear masks because we might have shortages, and it's like, well, so are you making recommendations to the public based on data and information, or because you are trying to manage public perception and behavior?
Yeah. And if you do that, why should I believe you? I mean, why should I believe you now? Because you already told me you lie whenever you think it's convenient for you. I don't think even that's, by the way, that I don't. There's a digression. I don't even think that's true. I don't think they really lied about masks. I think they just changed their minds and they're not very smart, and they think it looks better to say we were lying to you for your own good, rather
right?
than to admit they don't know what they're talking about.
That's right, or that they were out over their skis with the types of predictions and conclusions they could draw. So, okay, Richard, I've so enjoyed our interview. Now, tell our listeners about your new pronouncement. You are leaving Twitter for certain purposes, but not all purposes. So what happened? What's the drama? Give us the tea.
Oh, people are heartbroken. I mean, I love Twitter. I love trolling people. Maybe I love it too much. But they suspended me, first of all, for saying death to boomers as like a joke. This was hate speech against old people. And then once, it's so stupid. People, it's like I said, we'll throw an American off a cliff in your honor. Somebody said, I'm an immigrant. I want this job. I said, we'll throw an American off a cliff. Just, mockingly, jokingly,
facetiously,
obviously.
yeah.
And I appealed this, and they locked me out of my account for a week. So look, I'm an adult. I'm not a kid to be put in detention. So I'm not going to sit there and continue to use this product. Well, I am sitting there and use the product. I'm linking to my Substack. I'm staying informed on a few accounts and getting the notifications. But I'm not using Twitter as in the sense of scrolling, in the sense of talking to people, tweeting anything other than a link to my other work, because it's first of all, you don't need it. A lot of times it's news, but it's a replacement for other sources. You can read other sources for news. Often they're better, they're more detailed. You're given proper context instead of you could read the New York Times story itself rather than somebody takes a screenshot and says this is one paragraph. Look at this, and that becomes the center of the conversation. And then it's people I think enjoy it in the way that high school girls enjoy gossiping. It's people play their roles. There's this guy named Jason Stanley, who's this Yale professor, who's always saying, clueless, goofy things, and everyone laughs at him, goes, ha, ha, ha. And, I troll the leftists, and they all, they retweet my thing and say, oh, Hanania is weird. Here's this other stupid thing. And I'm like a character for them. And it's okay, that's been fun for a while. But, I want to be a serious person who thinks seriously about the world. And I don't think Twitter is necessarily the best place to do that. So, it's the censorship thing. I mean, I would leave even if I thought Twitter was good for us, but I think that it gave me a little bit of time to reflect, and I decided Substack is a much better outlet for and books and articles, of course, are much better outlets for expressing myself and getting my ideas out there.
Absolutely. And so on that note, what is the next field of inquiry that you are getting ready to dive into, or that you're curious about, or that you're thinking this needs more exploration?
So Paige, I'm finishing a book. I'm not ready to announce what it's about, but it'll be out soon. So people will be hearing more about that. And so I think in the immediate future, I'm probably going to be doing more on the Russia-Ukraine war. Maybe this is I don't know if this will be announced yet by the time this podcast comes out, but I'm gonna do an event at the University of Texas on November 7th on the election and forecasting the election and what the prediction markets say, and my take on sort of polling and where it goes right and where it goes wrong. So that's going to be coming up in the next few months. And for people who want to keep up, follow me on Substack. I said I'm not on Twitter anymore, but you'll at least get updates. And if you want to have notifications of what I'm doing, I'll be announcing it there. So Substack and Twitter are the places to find me. Just Google my name. It's not
excellent. And we will link to your pieces and to your profiles in the show notes of This Is Your Country when people listen. So Richard, maybe you'll come back on again after the election and we'll see how your predictions stacked up. But
I don't know if I'm going to be forecasting myself. It's more like, here are the ways of forecasting, and here's what different people think, and here's where I think the polls are right or wrong. I don't know if I'm going to give my own forecast, but absolutely. I'll come by and talk about the election or anything.
That's right. Let other people put their skin in the game, and then maybe you'll hire them. No, I'm just teasing. Richard, thank you so much for coming on This Is Your Country. Really enjoyed having you, and come back on again.
Thank you, Paige.
One thing that I'm really glad that we discussed in today's interview was the capacity for ideological doctrines that sound virtuous to actually be undermining and degrading our institutions that are supposed to be safeguarding the national interest and advocating for the public's welfare. And this is a thesis that I will continue to explore with future guests and in future episodes, so I hope you will continue to tune in. Thank you for listening to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey.